Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's so wonderful to see so many faces and so many names on, and we hope that you continue to join us as we get started. We're the Art Clinic Online, as you know, and today we have a wonderful special guest, Aishwariya Chandrasekar. Please correct me, Aishwariya, if I bungle your beautiful name. Aishwariya is a visual artist with traditional training in the art of kolam, which I'm putting up front so that pique your interest, which she brings into her art making. And I met her a few months ago at Artomatic and really loved her work and talked with her. And so I mentioned her to Jordan and we decided to host her as a guest, and she kindly agreed. She will tell us more about kolam, and I invite you already to go to our website, which we have cited in our invitations, and it remains in Jordan's website under the ACO tab. So you can see a little more of her work, but particularly a video about what kolam is. But she will tell us more about this. With a background training in psychology, neuroscience, and a master's in social anthropology, as well as business management training, Aishwariya applies her observations of social and individual human interactions and behavioral patterns in her work, showing us uniquely drawn, inked, and even embroidered surfaces and beautiful designs that emerge from those observations. She looks at our movements as individuals and within societies and gets inspiration through thinking through how we move in the world, and makes patterns that are very mesmerizing, bringing out some recurring and universal themes that we'll partly recognize and relate to, as well as really enjoy. I invite you to visit with us today. I didn't want to make a long introduction because you can read a beautiful brief bio on her website, so I didn't want to reiterate that, but I wanted to give her the opportunity to tell us a little bit about her art journey and about herself, and then open it up to questions towards the end. We'll get to see some of her art too in a sort of PowerPoint presentation. Thank you, Aishwariya. And if you don't mind telling us how you pronounce your name, just so that people don't hear it just from me, because I may have committed errors. So thank you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Mariana and Jordan, for having me and inviting me to join today. My name is Aishwariya Chandrasekar, and I'm a visual and traditional artist. And I'll go ahead and share my screen, and we can talk through some of my work. All right, so I like to start my presentation with this drawing, which is one of my first drawings from when I was probably 2 to 3 years old. I use a lot of dots and lines and circles and repeating elements in my work, and I just find I wanted to start off with this because I find it so funny that I try to really kind of dig into my own interests and my own subconscious, and I find meaning and interpretations in my work. But at the end of the day, I think that these kinds of figures have just been baked into my brain from such a young age. And so I just thought it was funny to kind of show this and show how much my influences have started from when I was so young. So I don't have a formal training in the arts. I just grew up in a very musical and artistic household. So my mom is a professional artist. My dad and brother are very interested in music. And so I grew up kind of being surrounded by music and art constantly. And most of my childhood actually was focused on music. And so I learned a lot of instruments, but a lot of those experiences too involve a lot of dots and lines as well, and were a different form of expression and exploration for me at the time. So I grew up surrounded by art too. I was always surrounded by the art making process, and I was always involved in the art making process, both in kind of engaging with my mom's work when I was a baby, but also then kind of picking up some of those skills and explorations. And so I've been creating for most of my life. And I will say that art creation for me is a very introspective process. It's a way that I learn more about myself and my ideas and my worldview and my values. And it helps me process my own experiences and feelings. And so that's the primary motivation for creating art for me. So as Mariana mentioned, my background is interdisciplinary. So I've studied pretty much along the line of looking at determinants of human behavior at different scales, ranging from the microscopic in neuroscience to larger trends in like a global scale and as a societal scale. And so that's something that has also influenced a lot of my work and themes, which I'll talk a little bit more about as we go through. So these were some of my earlier paintings where I started to actually formalize some of the doodles and sketches that I've been making. As I mentioned, I've been drawing and doodling for a lot of my life, but these were moments where I was taking the things that I was doodling, the patterns that were coming to my brain, and actually trying to put it into what I would call like a more formal piece of artwork. And so these were acrylic paintings on a canvas and using ink to draw patterns on top of it. And they were really just explorations in seeing what would come through if I took my own doodles and the things that drew my interest in seriously. And these were more explorations of paintings using different tools and materials that were around me and just seeing what would happen. It was a lot of experimentation at that time. So for example, the painting on the left-hand side was using those plastic embroidery pieces and just playing around with dots and seeing how paint would move through it. And it created something that was not what I was expecting, but interesting in its own right. And on the right-hand side, that canvas was used as a way to clear out my pen when I was working and needed to get some ink out of my pen. And again, I just kept playing with these things to see what would come from it. As I started working in pen and ink, soon after, and I realized that I was feeling a little bit more of an affinity towards this medium. So there was something about the simplicity of using just black and white, like not really engaging with colors and just using a pen on paper, which gave me so much room and opportunity to explore what I could do with those constraints. And so this led to a lot of explorations with figuring out how repeating these lines and patterns would create different textures and bring out these emerging patterns and create depth, while also kind of playing around with like different focal points and how overlapping elements over and over and over again on an imperfect scale, what would emerge from that. And so the piece on the left was one of my first explorations with exploring overlapping lines, and what emerged were these moire patterns, which honestly I was not expecting. It just came from the process of creating, but it was so interesting to see how those emerged by just kind of layering the same elements over and over again and repeating them. Something that I also think was interesting at this time is just kind of recognizing that the things that I thought were making my pieces imperfect, so like recognizing that the lines are not always perfect, and if you zoom in, there's lots of imperfections, but that actually added so much more character to the work, and I think that was a really important learning experience for me as well. And so like a lot of my work has been exploring these intersecting elements at different scales and at different sizes too. So I kind of range the size of my works. But like, for example, the one on the right-hand side is a very tiny drawing, but it was an exploration, and it helped me kind of progress in my ideas and seeing again what would happen when I just layered shapes on top of each other. And cross-hatching is always something that is so beautiful to me. I've always found it so beautiful. And so it was just fun to play with that with different lines and different shapes. So Something that has always fascinated me are fractals, and the relationship between what we see as a whole and its components. And I think that that's also apparent in my interest in my academic work and my studies in terms of looking at different scales of behavior. But I also was finding myself really drawn to things like Sierpinski's triangles. I generally do love triangles, and I've always loved drawing triangles. And so it wasn't super surprising to me that I loved the Sierpinski's triangle, where I could just kind of layer triangles within triangles infinitely. But I could definitely see that relationship between what was drawing my interest, between like the things I was reading and what I was studying, and what I was observing in the world, and just kind of looking at how the tension between the part and the whole was presenting itself in my artwork, in the world, in my studies, and everywhere around me. And those were the things I was really being drawn to. And that idea is something that I've been exploring since high school, when I was studying the role of human behavior in like utopian societies, but it just presented over and over again. And I think that idea between the like tension and the relationship between what we consider the parts and what we consider the wholes, and how deeply intertwined and influential they are on each other, is something that really drives me. And it's something I think about a lot, especially when we think about things like large scale social issues that we're trying to figure out, how do we address them? And there's these wide, huge influences and components, but there's also these tiny, tiny bits of action that influence them when taken on a greater scale. So I'll use this also as a segue to talk a little bit about columns, which Mariana mentioned at the beginning. And so this pattern on the right-hand side, not the triangles, but the wider outline, is a column, which is and that one's actually called an Aishwariya column. It was already called that. The fact that it's full of triangles was just a happy coincidence. But columns are a traditional Indian art form. They are dot and line drawings that women in India create in front of their household, usually almost every day. And so it's done with rock or rice powder. So throughout the day, people will walk on it, it will get disturbed in the wind, and then at the end of the day, it's cleared away and redrawn either that evening or the next day. And so columns are a living tradition. They're something that people still do. And my mom and I have been working on columns for many years now. We've received 2 Maryland State Arts Council Folklife Apprenticeship grants for her to train me in this traditional art form and to be able to communicate effectively with the public so we can continue passing down this tradition. And columns are something that I grew up with seeing. And so my mom actually thinks that the very first drawing that I showed from when I was 2 to 3 years old might have been my first attempt at trying to draw a column. And so these dots and lines have been part of what I've seen. They've become a part of my artistic vocabulary, something that I've found themes and connections to in the rest of my work as well. And so columns are another way that I've kind of interpreted that same tension and that relationship between the part and the whole. So these drawings are ones that I made which use pointillism. So it's pen and ink on paper. And so it's just dots creating these columns as we see them. And columns exhibit a lot of fractal nature as well, both in the fact that they are mathematically complex and they often reflect fractal patterns, but they're also when we see the lines that are created, they're actually just compositions of many, many particles of the rock and rice powder as well. And so that kind of then makes me think like, well, what is a line then? Is it, and so that was kind of my exploration here. But also in like maybe a more anthropological sense, when we think about traditions, they're sustained by repeated individual action and the choice to make them every day. And so as I was kind of exploring columns and bringing them into my artwork, that was something that that was influential and inspiring to me as I was creating these. I'm going to diverge a little bit because this is a little chronological, but these pieces I made during a time when I was focusing more on the components. So at this point, I was moving to different states and different countries for jobs and opportunities. And I was struggling, and I was trying to find ways to like adjust to new circumstances and new environments and new like building new communities. And I made these pieces, and I think it's interesting looking back on it now, because in the process of creating these, I kind of deprioritized the whole. I wasn't as focused on what I was trying on like the full composure of the piece, but rather a very, very obsessive focus on the components. And so each of these drawings are 11 by 14, and they're made just with tiny, tiny little circles using pen. And I think that I needed to make these pieces at those times because I needed to focus my attention on those tiny, tiny aspects of life and to find meaning and purpose in the process of making them. And so that's something that is interesting, I think, for me in my creating of these pieces, is that they weren't made to be viewed. They were made because I needed to make them. But I think that now it's really wonderful to be able to show them. And the first time that I showed them was at Artomatic earlier this year. And so I just included a little close-up of this piece on the right-hand side. So you'll see that they are just very, very tiny little circles making up the entire piece. And then just to kind of continue the chronological narrative, once I moved back to Maryland, this was during COVID, and I needed something to ground me, and we had just received another Maryland State Arts Council Folk Life Apprenticeship grant to continue our work with golems. And something that I was wanting to do was to create this representation of golem across 3 generations. So golem is a traditional, as I mentioned, it's a tradition that's passed down from women to daughters. And so my great-grandmother taught my grandmother and my mother, and then my mother taught me. And so golems are it's an art form that is just so generationally ingrained. And I think what I was realizing is that all of us were in different places, different circumstances. And I wanted to be able to showcase how all of us have continued to bring golems into our lives and have continued to showcase it in our artwork. And so my grandmother is an embroidery artist. So she does a lot of embroidery. She creates really beautiful pieces. And she was bringing golems into her embroidery. My mom has been bringing golems into her artwork for many, many years, and into her paintings and drawings. And then I was also bringing them into my drawings. And this is a very untraditional use of golems. They are not typically put on anything permanent. They're usually done on the ground. But I think that we were all reaching towards these familiar traditions and these patterns. And I wanted to showcase how the tradition, when we say the word tradition, sometimes it can feel very limiting. It can feel like there's a prescribed way to do it. And if you don't do it correctly, you're not doing it properly. But I think there was so much room for interpretation with golems, and being able to showcase how each of us had our different interpretations of it. And so inspired by that idea, I received a Maryland State Arts Council creativity grant to put together this 3 generations of golem show called Palais Marigot, which we held at Gandhi Memorial Center. And we showcased all of our different golem works. So my grandmother's embroidery, my mom's paintings and drawings, and then my black and white drawings. And this was a really wonderful experience to be able to put all of our work together, but then also just kind of celebrate how different our interpretations are and how much it's said about us with this unifying theme of golems. And so for that exhibition, I created a new series of golem work, which was really investigating golems and kind of decentralizing them as something that was so familiar to me, because I had grown up with them. And so when you see things over and over again, you start to be like, yeah, this is normal. But I wanted to pay attention to them, and I wanted to explore them a little bit more, to really dig into my relationship with golems and how that has influenced my artwork. And so what I did with this series was I looked at different parts of the column. So looking at the grid, which you start with when you're drawing a column, you draw that grid first. So I would explore with the grid and play with that and see what would happen if I were to repeat that over and over again. Or if I'm taking the grid and if I were just given those dots, what would I draw if I were just filling it in, and then kind of overlaying the column on top of it. And then looking at the way that the lines in the columns move and then saying like, okay, well, if I was given that as a prompt, what would I do? And what came out of this was a really interesting realization that a lot of my work, a lot of my abstract artwork has actually been deeply influenced by the shapes and figures reminiscent of columns, but it was just something that came so naturally to me and felt so like it just felt like my expression. But as I went through the series, it really did make me like think carefully and like be able to kind of understand how influential columns have been on my artwork. And I think that was a really wonderful experience. And these were two other pieces that I made for that exhibition as well. And so this was, these are slightly larger than the previous three. They're 11 inches by 14 inches. And they're still examining different parts of columns very much in the same theme. So on the left side, the pattern repeating in the background is actually the same column as the one in front, just repeated over and over again. So it was very much, again, kind of playing with the fractal nature of these column patterns and seeing what happens when you layer them on each other. And on the right hand side, that was one of my first pieces where I was playing around with ink painting. And so this was actually a complete, like, it wasn't intended in any way. I had just been painting with ink when I was living in London because I was cleaning out a pen and I had extra ink water, and I was like, it seems like a waste to just throw this out. So I started painting with it, and it created this really interesting depth because it varies based on how much pigment is in one brushstroke versus another. And I think it was such a great moment, again, using the same shapes and patterns that I have been using since I was very young, but it was also kind of capture, like, I've always had this fascination with like, how do we represent things that can't be represented easily? Like, they exist the way they are because they're ephemeral. And so things like flame and smoke and water, like, we look at them and we're trying to see them, but they're actually this culmination of so many bits and particles of movement. And so that's always been something that's fascinating to me. And as I was creating this, I was like, oh, like, maybe what it is that I can't capture it, but maybe I can emanate it. And so this was one of the first explorations in that. But then as I was creating these column pieces and I was looking at this piece again, I was again a little taken aback by how similar those patterns that I've been drawing since like middle school were so similar to the shapes that you see in the column. Those kinds of curved lines, the points, and like the movement that within the column. So it was all a very it's all exploration and experimentation. These are some of my more recent pen and ink drawings. And so I've continued to play a lot with the idea of painting with ink. And that's something that I'm working on, but also kind of overlapping lines, repeating lines, and seeing what happens and what kind of movement gets created by doing so. And so these are, again, very much, this is just a close-up of the previous piece, but these are also very much inspired by those things that are ephemeral. And I'll say that these drawings were very much influenced by like a shell that I found at the beach, which had these gorgeous like dotted line markings, like something you wouldn't ever imagine to see. Like I wouldn't have ever imagined to see on like something I found in the ocean, but it was so beautiful. And it just kind of, it was so ephemeral too, because they faded actually within like a week or two. And I didn't realize that, but it was just like these moments of like looking at something and finding like so much beauty and joy in it, but recognizing that maybe that was happening because of the ephemerality of it. And I think that those are the kinds of lines of thinking and themes that have been really influential to me in the last couple of years. And then most recently, I've been in the last like year or so, I've been exploring embroidery. And so this mostly just started out of a desire to have a different tactile creating experience, because I have been drawing for many years and I wanted to keep exploring, but I was just feeling a little like I just needed to do something different with my hands than draw. And so I just picked up like some cloth that I had on hand, and I started doing a very simple running stitch. I have done embroidery throughout my life, but just in a very basic sense. And on even these pieces, it is probably the most simple embroidery stitch, which is just going up and down on a piece of cloth with a thread and a needle. And I was just, again, kind of in that focus of how do I capture the things that bring me joy, but bring me joy because of their ephemerality and because of their impermanence. And so in the last few years, I've spent a lot of time looking at water moving in different patterns, and just kind of like seeing how like leaves move when the breeze like hits them, or seeing how blades of grass move, looking at sunlight and how it hits different objects and materials. And I think that that's been something that I've been focusing on a lot more. And so these pieces, especially with the embroidery, are really trying to kind of focus in on those experiences as an individual in a world that like doesn't really afford us a lot of time and space to spend time looking at things like that. But for me, I kind of realized that I need that. Like I need to take those moments, and I need to like focus on those things. And so the embroidery has been definitely a different step for me. A lot of my other work is like very controlled and precise, but these have been a little bit more, I've been working on like building the more like free flowing elements. And so this piece was it was just something that I had in mind, and I was creating it, and I wanted to emanate the movement of water. And the way that I create these is that I have like a very general outline on a piece of cloth, and then after I have that outline, it is all like, but there's no measurements, there's no drawings of the lines. It's just kind of like, let's see what happens if I just continue. And I think that is what for me is interesting about the process of creating these, is that the lines move in a way where I don't have really control over it. It's just like if I decide on this outline and I decide on this, like I'm going to repeat these lines, the movement comes by itself. And I think that that's something that I've really enjoyed working with. And so this is just a close-up of that piece. So each one of those lines is literally just a running stitch, but it like each one of them is tied off separately. So that's probably the part that takes the most time, is like tying off each line. So each one of these like areas is one line of thread.
So Aishwariya, can I interrupt you for a second just to ask, it's not a running stitch. You are binding off each one as a line?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it is time consuming, but it is very it's meditative, and it's something that I enjoy doing. And these were a few more experimentations with embroidery. So again, like just playing with introducing color back into my work after a very long time, but playing with things like sunlight, like how do rays of light move. And something that I found is that, especially for those that I'm like creating in it as an impression of like water or movement or things like that, like the process of creating each one of those individual stitches actually really makes me focus on the thing that I'm thinking about, and it makes me focus about like each molecule of water, or like if I were to break that down even further, how does everything move? And these things that we look at and see as constant and permanent, if we think about them more, they actually end up being these components of like particles of all of these different pieces that make them up, and then also the environment that then allows them to be perceived the way that we are seeing them. And then these were just little experiments and kind of just playing around with some of those similar patterns, but bringing them into embroidery and seeing what would happen. And this is one of my most recent pieces. This is a piece that is approximate, it's 14 inches by 6 inches. And this again was an exploration. If I was looking at water moving and I was like, how could I possibly represent this? And I wanted to really highlight like the way that the sunlight hits water and how it moves in turn with it. And that was something that, again, I think the process here that I was trying to focus on is recognizing that when we create water, it's not, when I'm like looking at water, it's not something that I can just draw. Like me personally, I can't draw it. Other people can do it beautifully. I cannot. And so I think that it was kind of recognizing that there is this, like, you have to kind of, I have to like ease off my need to like control the idea of water when I'm looking at it, and rather just saying like, if I were to create these lines and then let them meet each other where they are, that's how I made this piece. Was that I had my first few initial lines, but then I let those lines meet each other just by working line by line and going back and forth between each section, and then using those like moments where they meet as those areas where I added just a touch of color, because I wanted to focus on like, how does the light hit the water. And this was a really fun piece to do. It was also a very long piece to make, and I was very happy when I was done. And I think that it was, again, made me really kind of focus in on what I was appreciating about these moments of experience when I was watching them. And this is just another close-up on it. So I think this gives a good impression of how the lines meet. And I think that's something that I've been kind of observing in the way water moves, when like two motions of water kind of hit each other and they create these ripples. And so that was something that I wanted to focus in on. I believe that that is the end of my presentation, but I will just like end with a few things to say that a lot of my influence with creating has definitely been my mother, who is an artist, and I've grown up with her and like with her artwork and being able to see her in her creative process. My grandmother also making art, all of my family who makes things, which is a significant chunk of my family. I think that process of making and being surrounded by that from such a young age it was very influential to me. But some other people that have influenced my work throughout the years are Anil Reverie, Amy Lynn Myers, Agnes Martin. I am very influenced by Aboriginal Australian artists. Their work is incredibly beautiful, and I've always loved seeing their work and their impressions of nature and the world around us, as well as all traditional artists. I love seeing how traditions are passed down and how especially younger generations are interpreting them and bringing them into the world that we live in, globalized, very different world than where the traditions might have started, but seeing how that enters our lives every day. But also generally, like, as I said, like, it's those like little subtle moments where I'm connected to the world in a life that isn't really built to give us space and time to appreciate those things. And so giving attention to those things that are so easy to pass by or like to call normal are like, and those things that can't be captured easily, those are the things that really inspire me and what my work is meant to be an homage to, because those are the moments and experiences that keep me going and give me joy and purpose. So thank you all, and if you have any questions, let me know.
Thank you. This was fantastic. I think you so well explained why I was mesmerized by your art, because it sort of took me to a universal that, like you said, many of your influences, but you also sort of transcend your influences, and it brings up for the viewer other art forms that we also have seen, but that we wouldn't necessarily associate immediately with you, like Aboriginal, like Alaskan art, the Inuits, and and I'm Greek, and all the Greek traditions of embroidery and crocheting and all those minute arts that women forever, mostly women, but men have done them too, have dedicated themselves to. And it brings up for me as a physician what an important role art making has in human endeavors and healing our paths, and helping us to be parts more, perhaps better members of society because of it. So this is fantastic. I almost want to ask you if you have pictures of the back of some of the embroidered pieces.
I don't have pictures, but I could grab the back of it if you
would you mind?
Yeah,
that would be fantastic.
Yeah,
and yes, and I want to open it up to questions also, if you don't mind, in the chat, or unmute yourselves and ask us, please. And when she comes back, I'll read from the chat as well.
So
oh, that's gorgeous. Yeah.
Piece. This back. Yeah.
Wow.
So,
and
yeah.
did you change or tint the sort of yellow white thread? Was it tinted after, or was it a varying tone?
So it's mostly just ecru thread, which I'm always in a perpetual search for. And then I have a separate, like a slightly gold thread. It's more like an ochre, I would say, but it ends up looking a little bit more gold. And so generally with these, like the thread itself isn't very shiny, but I think that with the way that it moves, it ends up having more of a metallic sheen than
very interesting. It's funny, my screen was doing a little bit of a back and forth. I don't know if yours was too, on the embroidered pieces in particular, because they were 3D or more 3D than the ink pieces. And it was sort of shifting to different parts of the so-called wave. I don't know if anybody else's were doing that too. And I think it was my own eyes sort of internalizing the patterns.
My computer does that.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Did anybody else experience that?
Part of Zoom too. It's like, I think a lot of the Ethernet type stuff.
Okay, yeah, that could be.
Yeah.
Yes, so Ed said yes. And also someone is asking about clouds. Have you perhaps drawn some observations or connections to them? And Liana also has a question.
I do look at clouds a lot. I drive a lot right now. And so I spend a lot of my time driving, looking at clouds safely. But but I definitely do. I have been looking at like clouds a lot, and I think that they definitely do kind of strike me in the same way as like kind of the ephemerality of them and the way that they move. I think that I probably need to spend more time like dedicatedly looking at them to see how they move over time, to be able to kind of immerse in that. But I have been thinking about it. I am not quite at the point where I figured out how I would want to represent them, but I am thinking about it. So thank you for reminding me.
Well, good for you. Liana, you had a question. Okay.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing your beautiful work and the path that took you to where you are now. I wondered, when Mariana was talking about the appearance of movement, when we look at especially your thread work, It reminds me very much, I come from a background of weaving, and especially when you use very fine threads and you weave, there are certain kinds of materials in the threads, whether you're using a rayon or a cotton or a silk, that the final kind of fabric, depending on how the light hits it, actually helps with this perception of movement. And I wonder if when, our computers are, we're taking a digital image of really a three-dimensional object, which your surface is, whether that's what we were seeing on the screen. That was the point I wanted to ask Mariana about. And I wonder if, because when you're working with your embroidery piece, I'm imagining that it's not absolutely perfectly flat, because there will be the tension created just by the threads. Is that create? Do you find that how you mount it affects your perception of that movement, of the threads?
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that so as I'm creating these, I am definitely learning. I'm learning the new medium and trying to figure out the best way to do them. I will say that one of the first pieces I made was a circular piece, and that one really, I really struggled with the tension on that one, and it created these like very dramatic like lifts and falls. And I was so disappointed with it, and I was upset. And then I framed it, and I was like, you know what, like I made this, I'm gonna put it up. And it ended up with the framing, it looked sculptural. And I think what I'm trying to embrace, like as I think I've tried to do like throughout, is like I'm very much a perfectionist. I do tend to want everything to be perfect. But I think that all of these like experiences of creating remind me that like maybe the most wonderful things come from like the imperfections and the mistakes that I would be like I wish that didn't happen, but it ends up like adding a lot more depth to these pieces, which I think is especially more like, I think it makes it for me more visually interesting because of what you had mentioned too with the 3D nature of the thread on the cloth anyways. So it adds this very like sculptural element to it. That being said, I do feel like these ones where the lines are moving and then they're kind of binding into each other, the tension wasn't that much of an issue for those. It's more the ones where I have a circle or like straight lines where it's pulling. And so I'm still figuring out how to do that. I do think that probably when I mount it, the stretch of it will take out some of it, but maybe not all. So I'm still figuring that out.
Great. Well, embrace your whole experience with it, because I think with all of these discovery elements that fascinate you so much, that you're going to probably love more and more the sculpture effect that you get. Yeah, very cool. Thank you for sharing your work.
Thank you. And can I ask you a little more about the ink pieces and the pencil or whatever? Do you use actual nibs, or are you using a fountain pen or micron pens? What do you prefer?
I love micron pens. I think the one that I use a lot is the Micron 3. That's the one that I love, and I use that for most of my pieces.
I'm sorry, can you repeat which one, Aishwariya?
The Micron 3. That's the one that I use the most.
Okay, how do you spell it?
It's the Micron pen, just the
nib side.
Sorry. Yeah.
And then for the ink painting, I was using previously the ink that I had used in like a fillable pen, but I haven't used those pens as much. I haven't figured out how to work with them properly yet in my work. But I now just use ink and I dilute it to different concentrations and then use that.
But I want to clarify, you probably don't use any rulers, right? Because you're exploring sort of visual and mental almost patterns. Or do you use rulers sometimes?
I will sometimes use rulers for creating the initial outline. So especially if for things like golems, while I'm like, traditionally you don't measure it on the ground, you just do it. But when I'm putting it into a more permanent representation, I definitely have to measure things out. And I will say for a lot of my abstract pieces, I will give myself like a general outline. So like I'll kind of decide on the shape and measure things out as needed. But then the actual like the repeating lines and things like that, those are freehand.
Yes, yes, thank you. That's
May I ask a question? This has been really wonderful, so thank you so much for sharing. I'm personally obsessed with the idea of permanence versus impermanence, and I read the Dorian Gray kind of story, the idea of this piece of art that is constantly changing and evolving over time. And it's always been something that's rattling around in my head. And you're kind of talking about the ephemeral and as subject matter, but also kind of the heritage of Cologne being, you know, something that is redone at the end of the day, or just throughout the day deteriorates and then it redone kind of thing. And I was wondering, like, if you're thinking about these permanent things like an ink drawing and maybe forcing your hand a little bit so they become a little bit more impermanent. You know, I know there's inks that are highly light or are very light fast versus not light fast, but the idea of something that you've created is very permanent, but you know, maybe your materials are purposely bad, so they kind of change and evolve. Is that something that kind of you think about it all, or are you happy with kind of the permanent idea and the ink being a very permanent thing?
That's a great question. I don't think I've ever really thought about my materials and the permanence of them. I will say that like I do a lot of the column work that I do, like not outside of like the art, like putting it on paper. I also have done like a chalk mural where like I do have to just kind of recognize that it's going to fade over time. I think someone leaned on it recently and it's like smudged. So I think that there is kind of that acceptance on the column side. But I will say that I think for a lot of my artwork, it's more the interpretation of the impermanence that I've focused on. But that being said, that's a really interesting path to consider, and I'll have to think a little more on that.
The other question I had was, you know, I know your background is in, you know, other things besides like Western classically trained painting or whatever that may be, like psychology, for instance. Does that influence how you go about making art? Does how you feel when you go into this beginning of a line stitch or a line drawing, does that affect how that line is created, do you think? Or is it just, you kind of go into this mindset and it's kind of even keel all the way through a piece of art? Does that make sense? I guess it's two questions, sorry.
You're good. I'm sorry. I'm trying to parse, like I'm trying to figure out. Could you repeat that question?
Yeah, we'll break it down into two.
Okay.
First question would be like, how does your background in non-art things like psychology influence your work? Let's start there.
I think it influences it a lot. I think that I like my background is super interdisciplinary, and I feel like the biggest thing I got from it is something that influences my art greatly, which is just kind of being like sometimes like I felt like when I'm in a discipline, you're taught in a particular worldview. You're taught with a particular set of like, this is what matters. This is our ultimate goal in it. This is how you build the skills to be able to work for that, to meet that purpose. And a lot of times that's also kind of oriented into a particular career. But I think that what's happened because because of the shifting of disciplines, I've constantly had to decenter the perspectives that I think I have. And I constantly have to kind of look at the world in different ways. And I think that moving through different disciplines for me, that has been the biggest thing, is like recognizing that what I might see in my worldview now can be radically different from the way that I see it in 5 years. And then that it's radically different from how someone else will see it. And I think that kind of like understanding of my own like perceptual limitations is something that I bring into my artwork, because I try to kind of approach it the same way, where it is very much, as I mentioned, like an introspective process. So when I create, it's like if I were to like disconnect from a lot of these different like purposes that I have, or the things that I need to do, like what would I create? And I think sometimes that's why like it's such a personal experience for me, because it is almost like, how do I like excavate myself from all of these different things that I like, that we all have to do in the world.
Yeah. We've had a lot of kind of artists talking recently about that kind of, they're not necessarily classically trained in a Western manner. Like Steve Wannell 2 weeks ago was very much a pursuit of these different ideas than, creating a beautiful picture kind of thing. Like very, I'd say he's kind of ephemeral too in a lot of ways. But that idea is that your training definitely influences your work, but it doesn't have to be like a craft kind of thing where this is how you do an oil paint, this is how you do a figure drawing kind of thing. And I think that we put such an incredible weight into the art education aspect, but I don't think anymore at this point that you particularly need to have this training to be good at what you do. You just have to have a voice of yourself. And then this is me on a rant, of course, but anyway, but the other question I had was, when you go to a piece of work, whether it be a stitch or a line, does your mindset at the time influence the way that goes? Or do you feel like if you are calm one day and anxious the next day, it feels the same to you? Does a line change based on your mood or how you feel?
I do think it changes. I recognize that like things like the spacing of my lines, like if I'm more like anxious or stressed that day, I'll tend to use longer, like I'll like, how do I put this? Like when I'm creating like the distance between going up into a cloth and going back down, like it'll be longer, and that creates less tension. And then by the end of it, my line is loose and I'm just kind of like, why did I do this? So, and then when I'm like when I'm enjoying it, I'm very intentional about like, this is me, like with the tangible action of like moving the thread and the needle up and down, and just kind of recognizing how I'm like fundamentally changing the cloth, but in actuality, like not really changing the cloth at all, which is interesting because like with weaving, like you're creating the cloth. With embroidery, you're adding to the cloth and at a very loose weave. And so I think that process, like I definitely notice my stitches are better. And I will also say that like, I feel like embroidery for me is so tangible and it's so different from drawing that like I sometimes just don't touch it if I'm not feeling good about it, because it's like it is something that requires so much concentration in terms of like managing like the tension of things, making sure that the cloth is being held at the right like tension too, and making sure that my stitches are good, and then not getting annoyed with the like millions of knots that I have to tie. So like I definitely do see like my mood and like where I'm at in that moment. It definitely affects embroidery for me more than I would say with like drawings.
Mariana, do you want to? Thank you. Sorry.
Yes, sorry. I have to ask a thread question, and if you've tried this experiment, and if not, to encourage you to try it one time. And this is related to how when we learn techniques and let's say, we're very intentional. So we know exactly how much spacing to put between stitches, or how much tension to put on a thread. I wonder if you have ever tried taking whether you work just with a white or an off-white thread or a gray thread, instead of taking the same value of the thread, to use a variegated value thread in your work, and to do the very same approach, and not allow yourself to become controlling about what emerges. But you might find some very interesting kind of result, because it happens in weaving, and there is a repetitive pattern that occurs with weaving when you use a variegated value of a thread. And it plays into this, you think randomness becoming random, it's not, it becomes a repeating pattern.
Right.
So I wondered if you may have tried it, and if not, I would encourage you to try that experiment.
I have not tried it, so I will definitely go look into that. Thank you.
It seems to me, this is so wonderful. It seems to me that this is your column. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's like women in India who are traditionally practicing the art of kolam and the evanescence of it and how they allow it to disappear the next day. I'm just fascinated by that. But you are kind of in the West. Absorbing so much. I'm thinking of your 3 generations work and exhibit. It must have been so incredible. But you're taking that and sort of bringing it more into the West where, you know, there's the issue of temporariness and permanence. And also you're making column patterns. Exactly like your ancestors were doing, and it's so fascinating to me. Do you or perhaps your mom, who I know is in the audience, might comment on what do you think kolam, and by the way, it's KOLAM, correct? Yeah, the kolam practice does for women in India who, you know, are not trying to exhibit, are not trying to, or they're not sort of more obsessive about it. They're just doing it as part of their daily activities. What do you think it means or supplies for them? And this is speculation, perhaps, but
yeah, I was gonna say I can't speak for the wide population of people who create columns, but I will say that I do think that I don't think that it's necessarily seen as like this is me making an art form, like this is me creating art. I think it is very much a daily part of life, but in another way that's so beautiful that art is such ingrained part of life, and the process of creating something every morning. Like if I could create something every day, I think I would be a much happier person. But I think like that idea of like starting every day making something, using your hands, moving your body, and being able to create something is really beautiful. And there are other like symbolic and like philosophical interpretations of columns as well. So like because it's made of rock and rice powder, it is part of the earth and it goes back to the earth. It feeds ants, birds, it feeds 1,000 souls every day. And then for special occasions and festivals and things, there are very elaborate, beautiful columns that are made to also communicate to the rest of the community. Like, this is what's happening in my home. Like, this person is getting married. Let's create this beautiful column. And it also serves as like a tool to communicate and build community. But I do think that like it is such a daily part of life that I think that it sometimes it's nice for me, especially as like someone who grew up in the US, to look at columns and be able to not just see them as like something that was like a remnant of my childhood or a remnant of like the festivals when we would celebrate it, but to kind of assign importance to it again and bring it into my life now, and to be able to continue that process in a different way. Maybe sometimes more permanent, but to hold true to the essence of it and in my way and my interpretations of it. But that being said, millions of people make columns, so I'm sure that there's like a million different interpretations and approaches to it.
that it's great. And do you want to tell us before we close up when your next exhibit is, so that if people want to see it in person, they might get a chance?
Yes. So my next exhibit will be in September this year at the Women's National Democratic Club. And I'm very excited. It is my first solo exhibition, and so I'm preparing for it, and I'll be happy to share the information with Mariana and Jordan to add on the ACO page if you'd like to check it out.
That is wonderful. Congratulations. Any other questions before we let Aishwariya go?
Yeah, I just had to add some of the things that she said, Aishwarya said. We do come from a family of weavers. So, whether we know it or not, there is that other aspect of tradition that, knowingly, unknowingly, you sort of tend to gravitate towards. And I just wanted to add that with Liana's like comments about weaving, it's part and parcel of our lives, even if we don't actively, do the weaving part. Yeah. So, thank you for this opportunity for Ishwarya.
Can I ask a question to you really quick? What is it like having an incredibly talented daughter? And have you ever had them thought, oh, I really don't want her to be an artist? Have you ever like said, no, do something else?
No, I have to tell you this, that ever since she was a baby, she started drawing very early. She would draw the shape 8 and write faces and flowers. So that was her way of working. And as early as 1 year old, she had her pencil and paper and would work on it. Over the years, it was just that she would come and sit on my lap because I needed to work. And the only way I could work with her, like when my children were little, like it was a part of it was having them on my lap and working. And invariably the brush would go to her hand and then she would be painting it. I still remember some pieces that are hanging there. I can see the subtle line that just won't go, but that's her line. And over the years, any problems from school, college, she'll come and sit on my lap, sit next to me, then maybe on my lap, and my pen will go to her. And then she'll be drawing on my artwork, talking about all kinds of things. And I actually started missing that when the kids got older and left, that they weren't working on my piece. Says that there at least one line. She'll come and say, I have to make a line and draw a line and then go. And I think the intergenerational part of it is so important that, I mean, you'd see it as a continuity rather than portions. And like what she said about the movement, it is about that. And I am very proud. I am very proud to see her work, and and she has her own way of doing things, very, very different from the way I would approach things, which I think is the beauty of it, is that though we have certain things that are common, and the column binds us in very subtle ways, but her interpretations and her idea, whatever she's done, has been her own, and I think that makes me so much happier because that's the way it's got to be.
That's wonderful, wonderful. Has she influenced the way you do your own work?
Oh, yes. Yeah, ever since she's little, she would just say these little words of wisdom like a little child's. I wanted to learn different languages, and I also wanted to paint, and I had only so much time. And so I was like, I can't do this. She said, take a year off, learn your languages, and then get to this. And I said, I can't do this. She said, why don't you paint your languages? And it just started a whole series of work, painting languages, painting what I wanted to learn. And, I mean, that's what it takes. It's a give and take. And, you learn, age doesn't matter. You learn from your child.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.
This is fantastic. Thank you so much. What a privilege to have both of you on. I wish your mom could be here too, of the tri-generational effort. It's wonderful. Well, we hope to continue monitoring your work and learning from it like you helped us do today. And we want to thank our donors and the Maryland State Council and the in Glen Echo for allowing and enhancing what we can do in this program. And I hope you come together another time to tell us about progress in both your art. So without any other input, if anybody else wants to say anything, I want to thank you for being here today. And we should have the video up on our YouTube space and also on Jordan's website, and a link right from there in the next couple of days.
Wonderful.
Thanks.
And then join us in 2 weeks. We have Kyunjin Lee coming up. So another fantastic artist presenting at the Art Clinic Online.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you, Jordan, for having me. And for
Thank you
inviting
so
me.
much. It was wonderful.
That was great. So much. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your week.
You too.
You too. Happy 4th of July.
You too. Bye.